is real. Listen.
Hi, I'm Traci.
And I'm Kathy.
And this is Curious Explorers. So, hey, beloved listeners, this is Traci and Kathy from Curious Explorers. In a recent episode, you heard Kathy's incredibly chilling tale of La Llorona, the legend that still persists today. So, Kathy's chilling tale was the first in a series of scary stories we're doing leading up to Halloween. But Kathy, talk a little bit more about the actual legend of La Llorona.
So the interesting thing about La Llorona is, well, first of all, people still report it, and it's predominantly, if we're talking about the United States, it's predominantly in the Southwest, but it's very much originates in Mexico. And when we look at it literally, people see a woman in white. She is a woman who's looking for children, and she needs these, essentially she needs these children to get through the gates of St. Peter, right? So she's a woman scorned. She murdered her children in a fit of anger, frustration, and some would say insanity. And then she gets up to the gates. Yeah, I mean, so her husband has left her, and she's fed up, and I would say she's probably grief stricken, and definitely, there's a level of insanity in there. So she gets up to St. Peter, the gates of St. Peter, and she's trying to get into heaven. And her family, her ancestors, her descendants, come to her and say, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! Where are your kids? Like you can't. What happened to your kids?" And so she's, oh, so now she's kind of back on Earth, looking for children that can redeem her. And she's not, she's not trying to fool anybody. She's grief stricken, and she's trying to find these children to come to paradise with her, come to heaven, whether they're her children or not. But the story itself it's both. So we have this kind of literal telling of the story and the experiences that people have. People absolutely report seeing La Llorona. They absolutely report hearing La Llorona. It's absolutely something that people are still afraid of. But it's also a symbolic story about the Spanish and what they did to Mexico. So it's a story of the Aztec people as the Spanish came in. So it's also this kind of not condemnation but judgment on what happened to Mexico, what crimes were committed against it. So there was a goddess, ancient Aztec goddess called Cihuacan, and her name means snake woman. She was a protector of women in childbirth, specifically in childbirth, which of course everybody knows is even today is a very dangerous time. And it was seen in Aztec culture as a time between life and death. So it was dangerous, but it also was a liminal space that only a woman could experience. And she was a literal figure. So she was a goddess, but she was an entity as well. She literally walked the streets at night. So she would go into women that were in childbirth. She was seen as an omen of disaster. And so this figure became symbolic of the disaster that was coming to the Aztec people. So she, as the mother of the people, was also seen as foretelling kind of, this terrible disaster that was coming to them. And the disaster was the conquest by the Spanish. And the people were her children. So she was seen as this figurative, she was seen symbolically as what happened to the Aztec people. And then the story became a much more literal thing and related specifically to women in childbirth. So it's a story of loss, and it's either the story of the loss of children and the loss of one's sanity and the loss of one's kind of responsibility and love and care. But it's also a story that explains or attempts to explain centuries, the loss of land, the loss of culture, the loss of power, the loss of language, the losses that come through colonization, and the losses that come through empire. coming into another place and controlling it. So La Llorona is scary in a lot of ways. La Llorona is scary as this historical story, but it's also terrifying and it's figurative and it's literal storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, it is a great selection for your scary story episode or minisode, really.
I've always found La Llorona to be very scary, and because it combines a lot of stories that we tell and Western Europeans tell, which is like Banshee or the woman in white on the side of the road, and also this kind of universal loss of a mother losing her children, and then this horror that she was responsible for their deaths as well. And there's lots of different tellings. The one that I told is a very traditional one. So, but there are ones where, and it's always by the side of a river because it's like you can slip in and there's something about drowning a child that is, I don't know, it's like ephemeral as opposed to violent, even though of course it's violence. But as far as a scary story, I mean, if you think about this, we talk a lot about truckers. If you're a trucker on the side of the road, and you're in the Southwest and you see this figure and imagine that you're not of that culture. You know what I mean? When I think of these things as being literal or existing, this is one of the ones that gets under my skin.
Well, it's funny because I knew you were gonna present on La Llorona, and I did a little bit of, refreshing my memory because I had heard the tale before, but I had never really dived deeply into it. And I, I was struck by so many things, and I'm not really sure exactly where the best way is even to go with this, but, one of them is that a woman in white who is not who is no longer of this earth, but is earthbound in a way. So, I know some of them said she had no face or that her eyes were hollow, or another one, it's a pale woman, in this white kind of seemingly, sometimes tattered dress or whatever. But it seems like there are other myths and legends that talk about women in white who've undergone some sort of horrible tragedy, and even though La Llorona's said to have drowned her children to get back at her husband for betraying her, an incredible trauma for her and emotional loss,
Mhm.
right? She's left to wander the earth wailing and doing more. Do you have thoughts on the tying it into some of the other things where there are these women in white kind of roaming the earth?
So the common women in white that are reported, and I look at this as from a literary standpoint, and then I look at it from a potentially paranormal standpoint as well. I mean, this is a very common story, right? And it's a common story in every culture because there is not a crime that appears to be less human or more against nature than a woman killing her children, right? There's nothing that we can conceive of that is more against what we call human nature than a mother killing her children. In Greek mythology, it was Medea. I mean, it's just like, and even though it's like, God, he did this and he did that, it's irredeemable to us. And yet, we have compassion for it, and we have
Right.
empathy for her, even though she's still going around stealing other people's kids. However, almost universally, a woman in white is a woman who's mourning something. So if you see a woman in white in Western culture, woman in white ghost stories are a woman who died in childbirth, right? Or a woman who died on her wedding, died around her wedding night, or lost her lover or her partner. Um, and the white would be emblematic of it's either a burial shroud or it's a wedding dress or it's something that implies kind of a purity of ceremony, which is interesting because you and I talk all the time about whether something light and white is inherently less scary. But I would argue no. I would argue,
Depends on
especially in this particular case, because, and then you wonder, like, does she not look terrifying because she's trying to entice you in? And that does not seem to be the case. She does not seem to be a trickster, except in the fact that if you hear her far away, she's close. You know what I mean? But she doesn't seem to be tricking you. She's not beautiful and luring you in, and she doesn't have dolls for the kid. She's exactly who she is. And there also seems to be this lesson, which is if you drop your guard, here are the rules. This is how you can avoid her. However, if you drop your guard, if you don't believe, if you decide that you're smarter than the legend, you might be out of luck. If you follow the rules, you're going to be okay. Probably stay inside. Don't go by the river. Don't follow a voice that makes these sounds. But if you're gonna challenge that, you're gonna lose. And the women in white that
So
you're
Kathy,
referring to, Trace, don't generally even interact. Like generally, a woman in white, yeah, they're so grief stricken that they are stuck in the moment of their loss. And they're there usually, and it's usually they're there at the site of the loss. They're at a grave of a child. They're at their own grave. I have a gravestone in paranormal, and I have two things associated with Woman in White. And there have been people who've seen it. We just don't know what it's associated with. And one was a woman who died in childbirth, and another is a death mask of a young woman who died just on the eve of her wedding. So it fits both stories. But one of the things that I kind of want to bring up too is we are less forgiving of men when it comes to
women,
like no, like we if a man kills his family, we're not like, oh, but she was mean to him. Like, but in this particular case, we have this
right,
compassion for women,
right.
and that's why it is so alien to us. We're like, it had to be so horrific, or she could have never done
So
it.
so I have about 100 thoughts. I'm going to try to
Yeah, I'm gonna
contain them.
let you say it, right? So I won't jump
Okay.
in.
No, I mean, so when I refresh my memory about this legend of La Llorona and how she murders her children, she drowns them because her grief and her rage,
Mhm.
and I think we have to acknowledge that,
Right.
are so great that her husband betrays her, that she really destroys the evidence of their union.
Right.
Right? And then is grief stricken. So we think about people, mothers, as you said, killing their own children, it's incomprehensible. But even in the more modern era, true crime examples where women have murdered their own children, there's a spectrum of how much compassion we can have for them. And it seems like their mental state and the motivation make all the difference, and they're not always the same, right? Because you would say on the surface, if you kill your children, you yourself are irredeemable. But I looked up a few recent cases that I remembered. I'm sure you'll remember, some of our listeners will remember, and they evoke very different emotional responses.
Right.
So, Andrea Yates, 2001, it's one of the most publicized cases of maternal filicide, which is the term for when you murder your own child. Infanticide is another term for killing a child. But Andrea Yates, for people
Mhm.
who may need a refresher, she confessed to drowning her 5 young children in a bathtub in Houston, Texas. Now, she was a youngish mother. She suffered for years from severe postpartum depression. It was a psychotic depression, and a lot of people don't realize that women do experience not only postpartum depression, but where it's so severe that you become psychotic.
And
She
this
also
is the case that made that kind of like the Andrea Yates case
right.
is what brought that I think to light in a popular where common person became to understand it.
And she had had years of well-documented mental illness, schizophrenia. Her husband was aware of it. I think her husband and mental health providers had said that, she was at risk of doing something
Mhm.
to herself.
Yep.
I don't remember if it was that they thought she would harm her children. I'm pretty sure that they had some thoughts that she might. This is a person who was an otherwise, at her healthiest, loving
Mhm.
and devoted and actually hyper traditional
Right. Very
woman.
Christian, very devoted to the church, very Christian.
Had 5 children
Yep.
close in time. I would have to look it up again,
Yeah.
but there was no break.
Right.
There's so much there that we couldn't even fully unpack tonight, but She was initially found guilty of capital murder in 2002. And I remember how many people said, I don't care about her mental health issues. She did this thing. Only a monster would do it. It's unforgivable. And she was having psychotic symptoms
Right.
at the time.
Mhm.
Like she thought she had to do this. In 2006, she had a retrial, which was not nearly as publicized as the original trial. And the jury found her not guilty by reason of insanity.
Mhm.
And she was committed to a state mental hospital.
Right.
But when I think about someone whose mental state was so, I'm trying to find the word, but where she felt she had to do this.
Compromised. She was just utterly compromised. It was
And if it's all along the way, she didn't get the degree of help she
right.
needed. And that could say I feel incredible compassion
Right.
for her, the husband, the whole family,
Right.
because it's a horrible situation all around. I don't think she was competent to make the right decision, to make a better decision at the time, and it's horrible.
And the case is one of those
Now we
cases that, like, the husband was like, "I'm not sure I should leave her alone," and there was question. Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of those cases where people started to think, like, you gotta trust your instinct in this, you know what I mean? Like, she felt she shouldn't be left alone. Her mother felt that she shouldn't be left alone, but it was circumstances were too difficult for them to not do that, and then 'cause and it I agree, that was one of these cases where you're like, "This was the most horrific thing imaginable," and yet there was compassion and empathy for them because they
and
feel like there was
for
something else.
her,
Yeah, 100%.
the
It was
most
it
horrible
it
thing
was like she
imaginable.
just didn't get the help that she needed to get, and you could feel the her on the inside, the mother on the inside was trapped in the illness,
The
and that
illness.
yeah,
So, and I think it's also what happens when people, your average person isn't knowledgeable enough to
right.
make that call necessarily, right? To know that, oh, she might not be in a state where she should have children back to back without having this treated, and maybe it's too much for
And
her.
that line is something you never think is gonna get crossed. You might be like, "Well, she's in pain." She would never do that because it's like it's like drinking bleach. Oh, your body's gonna react, it's gonna stop you from doing that, but that wasn't the
There's
case.
no punishment. There's no punishment on earth that's as bad as what
Right,
she herself is experiencing probably every moment. But we contrast that with other people who we're not sympathetic to, and we
right,
say, "This person is," like you said, irredeemable.
right.
So one of them that comes to mind is Susan Smith,
Yeah. That's exactly who I thought of
1954.
too, yeah.
Oh my god. So she initially there's so much wrong with her and what she did. She murdered her children. One was 3 years old and one was 14 months, and then she said that a black man had abducted them, and this was in South Carolina, where obviously people readily believe that for a variety of reasons. We live in a social context. The lie she chose was very specific, completely racist, and
Intentionally racist,
it
yeah,
turns out
mhm,
that, yeah, intentionally racist.
mhm.
And after a 9-day intensive search by police, by community members, she confessed to having rolled her car into a lake with the children strapped inside. So the prosecutor said that her motive was to get rid of her children to pursue a relationship with a man who did not want to raise children. And so she was convicted of murder, as she should have been, and sentenced to life in prison. And that's something where we say, how is it possible that a mother would birth these two young children and then put her own desires above their very
You know
lives?
what's
And it's completely different.
yeah,
It's a completely different response we have.
right,
And do I think she was not competent or not at all? I think she is amoral.
right. Well,
It's a complete different.
and the interesting thing, right, is you could say, "Well, why don't you give your kids up for adoption?" Right? Why don't you put them into foster care? Why don't you leave them, but she wouldn't wanna be thought to be a bad mother. That's the bottom line. The the idea of being a woman who is
Stigma.
called a bad mother was so great to her that she was like, "No, I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna kill them and create a story that I'm a victim as opposed to" yeah, like, that's a different that resonates very differently.
Right. No, I mean, and it's different. There's somebody who's a victim of their own mental state, and I really believe that Andrea Yates
Oh,
was,
I agree.
and and you're talking about Susan Smith, who is like a criminal,
Yeah,
and I don't have any problem see there. And it's a completely different thing because when you were telling the story, the legend of La Llorona, as horrified as we are, the fact that she later is grief-stricken and
right.
horrified shows us
It mitigates it.
her humanity
Right.
a little bit. It's not okay now.
Yeah, but she's
Um,
not going about it in a great way. She's, "Oh, I'm gonna take your kids." I'm like, "Oh, I just need a couple of kids."
yeah.
But
No,
it
she's still
interesting, like,
terrifying.
well, it is terrifying, though, like, it is terrifying because, number 1, what she's capable of, number 2, why she's doing it, but, to the point that you were just making, like, Andrea Yates is a victim.
Yeah.
She's a victim of a terrible disease that is completely misunderstood.
Ignorant society.
And it's a
A society
terrible.
that at the time did not have any idea how
Right,
to handle
right, and
didn't
understand.
get her the help she needed.
Did not understand what. So she's a victim. Susan Smith is a monster.
She
She
is.
is, and yes,
A monster with a baby fa
there may be mental illness in there. There may be, but there was obviously an awareness of right and wrong because she hid it. Andrea Yates didn't hide it. Andrea Yates was caught in a moment where her reality was not reality.
right.
And this is not me, I'm not banging a drum for Andrea Yates. But what I am saying is
No.
there are illnesses in this world. And to stay with the subject matter of our
Yeah.
podcast, that have been considered to be so beyond the pale, so outside of social norms and things like that. They've been considered to be divine or demonic, right? So infernal, like Andrea Yates, you could almost see if this had happened in the 1600s, you would be like, that is an act of the devil. And it would totally seem like it would be because it's so separate and so outside of what we believe human nature is capable of doing, and that the person within that is also a victim, that there were 6 victims in that bathroom that day. It's one of the wo it's a
I
fu
think she was trying to save
Yeah,
them
she did.
from
Yeah.
the she's doing the worst possible job trying to
Right,
save her children, even though we know
right.
that
But to her, it was the only
that's
one that was available to her, and her delusions.
the only option.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
if you read the Andrea Yates case and read it, it's really it's just.
it's awful.
It's like someone was just juggling and there was
Mhm.
so many missed opportunities, but it also was one of those cases that moved the needle and so many more people got help and were able to be helped because of what happened with Andre Yates, because all of a sudden people were like, this isn't black and white. We cannot ignore this anymore because the baby blues. That's what people used to call it. The baby blues. It's like, no, no, it's so much more significant than that. And she did
Mm.
have, her case was an extreme case, but there are lots of people who go through,
Oh my god.
an extreme case and they're essentially left to deal with it. Although I do think like that case moved the needle. With Susan Smith, there's no needle to be moved. This was just a horrible person doing a horrible thing and in the most
So,
horrible way.
can I just then this is a tangent from there, but it's related because a lot of the times I think people say, "Well, how and why?" Understandably, because, there's a range, right? There's a range of an internal sense of morality for in the population. There's a range of what that looks like a little bit, not for something like that, not for like murdering your kids, but there's a range of the capacity for empathy. And there are people that I would say are average, everyday people who might be capable of sympathy
Mhm.
or do their duty because they're guided by an idea of right and wrong, but
Right,
they are low empathy, right? So
right,
they're not tuning into how it feels to be cared for or not by them.
right.
There's this misconception because I'm going to talk about psychopathy, and we can maybe get into this more in another episode because there's a small but not insignificant subset of people, and no one really knows how many. It's estimated in the general population like 1 to about 4.5, 5% of people would meet criteria for psychopathy. So no empathy, only motivated by what works for them. Rule breaking, like, in a big way. So, things some would be on the more sadistic end of the spectrum. So, there's not gonna be any remorse or any concern for, something other than what works for them. Now, like, in a prison population, you're gonna see a higher percentage, maybe could be 15,
Right.
as high as, like, maybe 25% because, they've done something to
Right.
wind up there,
Right.
usually. But the reason I'm bringing that up is that there are other cases, and I'm gonna mention this one just briefly. This woman, I had not heard of this, and this is recent, Crystal Candelario. I guess this is more recent, 2023, but she was charged with leaving her 16-month-old daughter, Jaylin, alone for 10 days while she went on vacation. So, of course, her daughter died from dehydration and starvation, a
Mhm.
toddler. And it's like, what works for me? And I think that's a huge difference in terms of, we say, like, what is this person's motivation? The other thing with that is that I think, there's a very common misconception, and it's a chilling one, and maybe this is the scary real life story component to all this, is that there's a subset of people walking among us, and they look like everybody else, and people assume psychopaths are only men. Not true. People assume sadists, people who enjoy inflicting harm on others, which is another subset, are only men. Not true. And that the grandmother in your neighborhood, or the person who is your physician, or the person who is your clergy person, or your daycare worker, or whatever, these people are in every aspect of our lives, and thank God most people aren't like that. But it's why when you look at Susan Smith in those old news clips, she looks like this baby face, butter wouldn't melt in her
Mhm.
mouth, chubby cheeked, fresh
Right.
faced, young
Right.
woman, and you would never say that if you passed her in the supermarket, you wouldn't have been like, "This woman looks
Yeah.
like she'd kill her own
Right.
kids,"
Right.
right?
Mhm.
We always think it's gonna be, somebody who looks like they're out of a horror movie,
Right.
and to me, that's even scarier than some of these legends, because these legends remind us of what real people are actually capable
Right.
of.
And they remind us of our boundaries, our behavioral boundaries. Yeah, I definitely think that the true stories are far scarier than La Llorona. And at least with La Llorona, we have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And somebody is telling us the story. Somebody is telling us the moral of the
The
story.
moral of it,
Right. There's a moral to this. This is to educate us in a certain way. When it comes to the
don't
to
do
yeah, and when it comes to the senselessness, because the Susan Smith story
mm,
was senseless because there were so many alternatives. So, what that story tells us is that sometimes the fiction or the story that's being told inside someone's head, is these small things were so much more important to her. It was so much more important that she not be thought a bad mother, that she not be thought, oh, she chose she did choose that man over her children. She did. She chose that. So it wasn't like she had a problem choosing that. She just had a problem dealing with people saying that. And so she
and
killed.
implicating somebody else who could have gotten the death sentence.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Well, and then she built it that way. She built it, and she specifically built it because she's like, "This is what people will believe." I'm gonna lean in on the lowest, worst part of humanity because I know that there's gonna be enough people out there that they're gonna and remember, looked at the car and, and then with Andrea Yates, you realize that there was no duplicity. There was no hiding. In fact, she just was like, I kill me. Like, I don't want to be alive anymore. And not that you have to say that in order to justify or in order to be, but she clearly had been desperately in need of help. Desperately. In fact, if I remember correctly, her husband took a lot of flack too. And I have compassion for him as well. But I do think there was a point at which we are like, you knew you were with her. There was
I think the doctor had said maybe don't have any
yeah,
more children.
more than and the
Not
doctor had said I don't know if she should be alone with the kids. She'd never expressed an ideation about hurting them, but she definitely was not capable of caring for them. So, and I remember when this happened, I had nieces and nephews that were the same ages as those kids, and I remember the story is so horrific because it's like the oldest one fought to protect his siblings. So, it wasn't this quick and easy thing. So the narrative that was going on in her head was very powerful, and it wasn't something that she dreamt up that morning. And again, it just comes back to this idea that we didn't know what we didn't know at the time. We didn't and I do think people have a greater capacity of compassion for her now than they did then. Although I will say, I think people were like, this is a different case than and even the case of the woman leaving her daughter to die. I mean, I was reading a case yesterday where this woman brought her son out. I think and she was a young woman. She was like 21 or 22, and she brought her 4-year-old son who was special needs and brought him out to a swing set in February, and she just kept swinging him on the swing set for 44 hours, and he died, like, halfway through from hypothermia, and clearly, there was so much stress in that household because she did it in full view of the neighbors and everything like that. So when you look at things like that, I read that story. I had a lot of compassion and a lot of empathy for the mother. I'm not thrilled with, with what happened, but I do feel like, well, somebody dropped the ball. This person shouldn't have been alone with them. And of course, nothing and no programs are going to be universally successful or universally applied, but there are definitely situations that happen that do lead us to have empathy and compassion. And then there are cases that do not. I totally agree. I think the stories are the stories of the real stories are far more terrifying. Although that being said, I'm still not going to walk by the side of a river anytime soon. And if I hear you and you
Especially
sound far away from me, I'm running. That's it. That's it. I'm out.
in clothes, by the way, I'm still
Yeah,
ready.
yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well, this was a scary addition to our scary stories episode. I'm super looking forward to the next scary
Mm.
story we do on the next episode.
I would love to hear scary stories from y'all too. I would love for you to tell me some of
Yeah.
the scary stories in your
Um,
neighborhood. If they're not
Absolutely.
and if they're not universal, that's fine. We'd like to hear the little ones too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you have a personal story that's super scary, send it to us. Go to our website. I always put the link in the show notes, curious-explorers.com. If we pick it, if it's great, we might pick it and read it on the
We
podcast.
might read it if it's
So,
okay too. Who knows?
even if it's pretty good,
It's fine. You know what? We'll read it if it's fine.
if it's a B plus, we might
Yeah,
read it.
we'll read it if it's fine.
But anyway, Kat, so good to
Good
see
to see
you
you.
despite the chilling,
Yeah.
nothing too weird. And, beloveds, until next time, as always, stay curious.
Keep exploring.
Bye for now.
I know that the paranormal is real. Listen.
You've just listened to the Curious Explorers podcast with the Kathy Kelly and Traci Stein. If you enjoyed the episode, remember to like, share, follow, leave us a comment, let us know what you think. And of course, until next time, stay curious.
The paranormal is real. It is real. The paranormal is real.
The paranormal is real.